Penguin Random House Audio presents Gods of the Upper Air. How a circle of renegade anthropologists reinvented race, sex, and gender in the 20th century. By Charles King. Read for you by January Lavoy. For Maggie. Who else? I do not say that my conclusions about anything are true for the universe, but I have lived in many ways, sweet and bitter, and they feel right for me. I have walked in storms with a crown of clouds about my head and the zigzag lightning playing through my fingers. The gods of the upper air have uncovered their faces to my eyes. Zora Neale Hurston, Anthropologist, 1942. A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die, and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. Max Planck, physicist, 1948. Chapter 1. Away. On the last day of August, 1925, the triple-deck steamship Sonoma, midway through its regular run from San Francisco to Sydney, slipped into a harbor formed by an extinct volcano. The island of Tutuila had been scorched by drought, but the hillsides were still a tangle of avocado trees and blooming ginger. Black cliffs loomed over a white, sandy beach. Behind a line of spindly palms lay a cluster of open-sided thatched houses, the local building style on the string of Pacific islands, known as American Samoa. On board the Sonoma was a 23-year-old Pennsylvanian, slight but square-built, unable to swim, given to conjunctivitis, with a broken ankle and a chronic ailment that sometimes rendered her right arm useless. She had left behind a husband in New York and a boyfriend in Chicago, and had spent the transcontinental train ride in the arms of a woman. In her steamer trunk, she carried reporters' notebooks, a typewriter, evening dresses, and a photograph of an aging, wild-haired man she called Papa Franz, his face sliced by saber cuts and melted from the nerve damage of a botched surgery. He was the reason for Margaret Mead's journey. Mead had recently written her doctoral dissertation under his direction. She had been one of the first women to complete the demanding course of study in Columbia University's Department of Anthropology. So far, her writing had drawn more from the library stacks than from real life. But Papa Franz, as Professor Franz Boas, the department chair, was known to his students, had urged her to get out into the field, to find someplace where she could make her mark as an anthropologist. With the right planning and some luck, her research could become the first serious attempt to enter into the mental attitude of a group in a primitive society, he would write to her a few months later. I believe that your success would mark a beginning of a new era of methodological investigation of native tribes. Now, as she looked out over the guardrails, her heart sank. Gray cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels clogged the harbor. The surface of the water was an oily rainbow. American Samoa and its harbor on Tutuila, Pongo Pongo, had been controlled by the United States since the 1890s. Only 3 years before Meade arrived, the Navy had shifted most of its seagoing vessels from the Atlantic to the Pacific, a strategic reorientation that took account of America's growing interests in Asia. The islands quickly became a coaling station and repair center for the reorganized fleet, which, as it happened, was steaming into Pongo Pongo on exactly the same day as Meade. It was the largest naval deployment since Theodore Roosevelt had sent the Great White Fleet around the world as a display of American sea power. Airplanes screamed overhead. Below, a dozen Fords sputtered along a narrow concrete road. In the Malaye, the open-air common at the center of Pongo Pongo, Samoans had laid out an impromptu bazaar of wooden bowls, bead necklaces, woven baskets, grass skirts, and toy outrigger canoes. Families were spread around the green, enjoying an early lunch. The band of some ship is constantly playing ragtime, Meade complained. This was no way to study primitive tribes. She vowed to get as far away from Pongo Pongo as possible. Her research topic had been suggested by Papa Franz. Was the transition from childhood to adulthood, with young women and men rebelling against their stultifying parents, the product of a purely biological change, the onset of puberty? Or was adolescence a thing simply because a particular society decided to treat it as such? To find out, Mead spent the next several months trekking across mountains, decamping to remote villages, drawing up life histories of local children and teenagers, and quizzing adults about their most intimate experiences of love and sex. It didn't take her long to conclude that Samoa seemed to have few rebellious adolescents. But that was largely because there was little for them to rebel against. Sexual norms were fluid. Virginity was celebrated in theory but underprized in practice. Strict fidelity in relationships was foreign. Samoan ways, Mead reported, were not so much primitive and backward as intensely modern. Samoans already seemed comfortable with many of the values of her own generation, the American youth of the 1920s who were going to petting parties, downing bootleg gin and dancing the Charleston. Mead's goal became to work out how Samoans managed to avoid the slammed doors, the boys' town delinquents, and the fear of civilizational collapse that obsessed commentators back home. How had they produced teenagers without the typically American angst? Or had they really? And oh, how sick I am of talking sex, 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 she wrote to her closest friend, Ruth Benedict, a few months into her stay. She had filled entire notebooks, written out index cards, and typed up reams of field reports, sending them by canoe through the breakers and over the reef to the mailboat. She watched with her stomach in knots, afraid that the outrigger would capsize and destroy the only reason she had for being on the far side of the world, or for that matter, the only evidence she had of something that could vaguely be called a career. "I've got lots of nice, significant facts," she wrote, the sarcasm wafting off the page, but she doubted that they added up to much. "I'm feeling perfectly pathological about my time, my thoughts. I'm going to get a job giving change in the subway when I get home." She could not have known it at the time, but there among the welcoming feasts and the reef fishing, on humid afternoons and in the lashing winds of a tropical storm, Mead was in the middle of a revolution. It had begun with a set of vexing questions at the heart of philosophy, religion, and the human sciences. What are the natural divisions of human society? Is morality universal? How should we treat people whose beliefs and habits are different from our own? It would end with a root and branch reconsideration of what it means to be social animals and the surrender of an easy confidence in the superiority of our own civilization. At stake were the consequences of an astonishing discovery: that our distant ancestors, at some point in their evolution, invented a thing we call culture. This book is about women and men who found themselves on the front lines of the greatest moral battle of our time, the struggle to prove that, despite differences of skin color, gender, ability, or custom, humanity is one undivided thing. It tells the story of globalists in an era of nationalism and social division, and the origins of an outlook that we now label modern and open-minded. It is a prehistory of the seismic social changes of the last 100 years, from women's suffrage and the civil rights movement to the sexual revolution and marriage equality, as well as of the forces that push in the opposite direction, towards chauvinism and bigotry. But this is not a book about politics, ethics, or theology. It is not a lesson in tolerance. It is instead a story about science and scientists. A little over a century ago, any educated person knew that the world worked in certain obvious ways. Humans were individuals, but each was also representative of a specific type, itself the summation of a distinct set of racial, national, and sexual characteristics. Each type was fated to be more or less intelligent, idle, rule-bound, or warlike. Politics properly belonged to men, while women, when they were admitted to public life, were thought to be most productive in charitable organizations, missionary work, and the instruction of children. Immigrants tended to dilute a country's natural vigor and breed political extremism.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?